It is so still that a match flame stands upright, invisible in the clear, hot air, the green of the grass, the lime-white walls of our rented farmhouse, the orange stuccoed roof edging the August blue sky. It is all too perfect for this world. I know those tiles. They are my tiles. And Steve Bergman, because we're going to call him that tonight, but really, of course, Samuel Shem, had not yet written The House of God, because that was going to be published about 6 to 7 years later than our first artichoke eating down in a house in the Périgord. So it started in France, that's certainly true, and so does the novel, incidentally, as you will discover. But there's another thing about that house in France, because, as he knows, next to my rambling farmhouse there is a little house. Really little. I mean, there's only 3 main rooms. 5 generations of people were in that house. Monsieur Péruchot, his mother, his grandmother, his 2 children, and that time his 3 grandchildren. Where on earth they all, that house is now mine, but where on earth they all slept, I don't know. I sometimes found odd structures in the loft, looking like old bits of beds, so perhaps some of them lived up there. But you see, I'm asking the wrong question. They lived together. It didn't matter in the tradition of, what should we call it, olden times, because after all this is remote countryside France with people still adopting a habit of generations. The old were cared for, and naturally so, by the structure of society. And I think that might be the best introduction that I can give of the real purpose of the House of God, which I think was a shock in 1978. Indeed it was. But its real purpose, of course, is to remind us that as a society we have grown into a situation in which that problem is now acute. And I think that's the best introduction I can give you, Steve. Over to you.
Thank you. This is, I'm so glad you're all here. This is a tremendous feeling of nostalgia for me. And actually to have Dennis introduce me so wonderfully. I arrived here in Oxford in 1966. We were met at the boat. I was on a Rhodes Scholarship, of course. I'd never been outside of the United States, okay? That's how naive I was. It was a terrible journey on the QE2. Everybody got seasick. We were picked up by a bus out in Southampton, met by this little guy with an umbrella. The warden of Rhodes House, whom we immediately christened the rodent of Ward's house, because he looked kind of rodential, you know, E.T. Williams, a Balliol guy. Drove up to Oxford, and all the Rhodes Scholars were on this same bus, and it was pouring rain. It was very cold. It was, and I was sitting next to a dear friend named Terrence Malick, who some of you may know. He turned into a wonderful, wonderful film director, right? And they were dropping us each of us off as we went around Oxford, and I was sitting next to him, and then somebody called out, "Balliol," you know, at me. I get up, and it's pouring, and Terry is on the inside seat, and he's looking out the window vaguely, and he sees, we were parked right outside of the Trinity wall. He saw this wall with looked like barbed wire and glass on it, and he was from Oklahoma. He had never seen this stuff, you know, cold and wet and all of that. And he looked around and his eyes got big. And there were these sort of Klieg-like shining on the road. His eyes got big and he said one word. He said, "Dachau." What have I gotten myself into? And the other, one of the things I'm going to talk about a little bit is, in each of our lives, I'm old enough, many of you are too, that but for if a butterfly's wing went one way or the other, you would not be here, right? And that was certainly true of my life. And one of those butterfly wings was my happening to get the Rhodes. That was lucky. But the other butterfly wing, I've never said this to Denis before, is for me to hook up with him as his student. I mean, he wasn't really my teacher, or I his student in the sense that we did other things together. He was my teacher, officially, yeah. But for me to hook up with him, who, as I'll describe a little bit, is such an open-minded, wonderful man, was absolutely one of those butterfly wing things. If I had gotten a traditional Oxford Don who, wanted me to study frogs, I wouldn't be here. So, I came back to Oxford at one point during the summer when there was a gala or a gaudy or something like that, and Harold Macmillan was here, an old Balliol guy. I don't know if you remember this, Denis. And you were talking to him, and I was dying to meet him. We were all dressed up. And I went over to him, and Denis was there, and I said, I don't know what you call him, Prime Minister Macmillan or Macmillan, whatever you call him. And I said, you are known to be the greatest speaker, one of the greatest modern speakers in English history. Can you tell me, what's your secret to your success? He said, well, I'll tell you two things, he says. Number one, surprise them. Don't talk about what they think you're going to talk about, right? Number two, he says, a good talk is about just one thing. And I've never forgotten that. And I've surprised you. You didn't know I was going to talk about Harold Macmillan here. And what this is about is, as Denis alludes to, is what I've learned after all these years. And it's the only thing I talk about. It turns out even before I knew I was talking about it, I was talking about it. I didn't write the House of God because I thought it had something to do with compassion and healing and community. I wrote it because I had to write it. I had to write it. But the one thing I'm going to talk about, that I talk to a lot of medical students and doctors, is the danger, the risk of isolation, and the healing power of good connection. The risk of isolation and the healing power of good connection. And it's true in everything, whether it's medicine or it's life. And so what's a good connection? A good connection is a mutual connection. What's a mutual connection? And to this, I owe Janet Surrey, my spouse and longtime co-writer. This is a theory that she developed called the relational theory. A good connection is a mutual connection. And in a mutual connection, think about it, when you've had one of these, they're fairly rare, at least for us men. It's when you see the other person sees you, you feel seen by the other person, and the other person feels seen by you, and each of you senses the other person feeling seen. Each of you senses the other person feeling seen, and there's that click, right? Sometimes it's love, sometimes it's a coffee, whatever. And that's what I've learned. That's what really makes life living. It's what makes any job worthwhile, including medicine. And the ironic thing about medicine, which is basic here, is that we go into the profession, at least we used to go into the profession, because we wanted to be in those kinds of situations with people who were suffering, right? And what certainly in the House of God happened is we went into those situations, and there wasn't any kind of holding compassion that allowed you to think of anything really much but survival of the self. So it's a difference, I'll tell you, the difference between a self model and a relational model. And Janet and I have done a lot of different ways of writing about that, about the danger of isolation, the healing power of connection. We wrote a book about men and women called Healing Dialogues Between Women and Men. We wrote a play called Bill W. and Dr. Bob about this founding of AA, and I'm going to talk about those a little as well. I started on this DPhil with Denis, teaching cockroaches to lift their legs, which is rather bizarre, because I had done some of that work at Harvard. But I really wanted, deep down, to be a writer. And as I say, I worked on this thesis for a couple of years, and finally, and I started to write at a little cottage out in Kirtlington here. I got away from Oxford after the first year. I ate in Hall once, the first time. I never went back. I knew every Asian restaurant in Oxford, you know. By the third year, I was writing a lot and really loving it. That's what I really wanted to do. And I really didn't want to do science anymore. And I was sort of scared to tell Denis, because he was so wonderful. You know, he really took me in and other of his students in. And so I got a little sociopathic. I said, Denis, you know, I can't really continue this work unless I have a computer. He said, oh, well, you know, there weren't computers in 1968, really. They had things that were like computers. So he said, well, I'll see what I can do. So I then left on one of the VACs to get some sunshine. A friend of mine and we looked at a map, and we looked at the dark green around Oxford, which was rain and bad weather, and we looked down to where the first yellow was, which was the Sahara Desert. We got in a Volkswagen a station wagon, and we just drove straight there, okay? And on that trip, I had a kind of an epiphany at a camel auction, and with a belly dancer, etc. And it was one of those wild trips. And I realized I didn't want to be a scientist. I wanted to be a writer, and I had to tell Denis. I came back, cold rain in Oxford, you know. I walked into the lab to get my mail, and there are these boxes. The computer had arrived. Somehow. I said, oh, shit. So I went to the market. I got a lamb chop and a bottle of wine, or a couple of lamb chops and a bottle of wine. I went over to Holywell Manor, knocked on the door. He opened it. I was in my jalabe, you know, my thing that goes down all, you know, and a beard of 6 weeks and all that stuff. And he said, oh, and drenched, and come on in. And I just sort of burst out. I said, Denis, you know, I don't want to be a scientist. I said, I went over, I saw the computer. I don't want to be a scientist anymore. I want to be a writer. And my heart's in my throat. And he said, well then, Bergman, have a sherry. So we got drunk. And then at some point I said, well, you know, to keep on the Rhodes Scholarship, I have to be still enrolled in a degree program. Otherwise I'll get drafted. He said, well, you're still enrolled in the degree program, you know. So, and that was helpful, because I then had to face a choice between, a very easy choice between Vietnam or Harvard Med. And I decided rather than killing people or getting killed, I would try to save people from being dead. And so I went back. And well, I'll interrupt the chronology a little bit here. Now, let me keep on briefly on Harvard. Went back to Harvard. It was the 60s. Everything was pretty radical. I didn't like being there. I didn't do much. In the fall, in the spring of 1970, Nixon started bombing in Cambodia, and, you know, the Ohio State National Guard killed 4 students who were demonstrating, and then the whole country went up in flames, riots in the cities, everything. People were going out on strike in universities. So we at the Harvard Medical School first-year class had to decide whether we would go out on strike or learn the kidney. It was the kidney block. So people got up in the auditorium and they said, if we go out on strike, we're never going to learn the kidney. You know, and other people like me said, the hell with the kidney. You know, so I never learned the kidney. And in the House of God, the chief villain, the chief of medicine, is a kidney guy. The kidney is kind of somewhere between the back of the neck and the back of the knee, as far as I'm concerned. So I struggled through medical school. I came back here mostly every year. And then I had to do my medical internship. And So I was accepted. I decided, I went to the Beth Israel Hospital in Boston, and that experience of that internship, as I mentioned, was so horrific, it was so brutal, it was so inhumane in so many ways. If you've read the book, you know. How many people have read The House of God? Oh, wonderful, thank you, wonderful, that's great. It was so, you know, I'd never written a novel, I'd written everything else, I'd never written a novel. And I said, look, somebody's got to write this, and that somebody is me. And so I wrote it, every novel that I've written, almost every novel, starts with a feeling of outrage, right? In a recent interview, somebody asked me, why do you write? And I'd never thought about that, really. And what I told her is, I write to try to deal with injustice and to show the healing power of good connection. So I get outraged, and then I write a really angry first draft, and 7 drafts later I have a novel, you know. When The House of God came out, of course, it was, I don't know if you know, but I was roundly hated for it. It was too radical a book for the time. It's actually too radical a book for time now, you know, even now. I mean, John Updike wrote an introduction to the 25th annual, or the whatever, he wrote an introduction to one of the versions. He's a dear friend. And in it he said, this book would never be published now, you know. And Harvard hated me, and people spread bad rumors, but the older generation of doctors hated me. But people my age, this was telling the truth for the first time, you know, with a lot of sex and some humor, or a lot of humor and some sex, or some funny sex, you know, whatever you want to do it. And so it was really not, so, but the people my age, just, it raced out of the stores, you know, because they could, and I took a pen name because I was just starting my psychiatric practice. I didn't want my patients to know I'd written the book. They all found out anyway, you know, they didn't care. But I didn't take any speaking engagements for a couple of years. And until I got a letter one day we did letters in those days, you know. It's nice to get letters, you know. You see who sent it, you rip it open. It was from, it said, basically, it said, I'm on call in a veterans hospital in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and if it weren't for your book, I'd kill myself. I thought, well, you know, maybe people want to hear what I have to say. And so then I started, and I've never stopped, you know. Done an awful lot of this over the years, and it's always the same. It's what I said to you. Now it's pretty safe to go and talk, to say I'm the author of The House of God. But I'll tell you one story that was really funny. Several years ago, our daughter was having a potluck. Our daughter's young. She was young then, and her class was having a potluck, you know. And I was wandering around, trying to figure out who to talk to, and it was just parents. And I heard these 2 women talking, and they're doctors. I said, oh, that's interesting. So I get closer. Doctors from the Beth Israel Hospital, my alma mater. So I go up to them, I sit down, I wait for a chance. I said, you know, I may not be the most favorite person at the doctor at the Beth Israel Hospital. And she looked at me and with venom said, well, you can't be as bad as that guy that wrote that book. And there was this delicious moment, you know. Do I tell her? Don't I tell her? Of course I'm going to tell her. I said, well, I am the guy that wrote that book, you know. And she blushed, beet red, and that was the last play date our daughter had with her daughter. But just to show that there's redemption in the world, in 2009, I was a commencement speaker at Harvard Med, which was remarkable. But even more remarkable, I was invited to speak at the Beth Israel Hospital. 2009, 1978, that's how long it took. So I went to this same auditorium that I had been an intern with that I hated, and it's even worse now. It's run down like a third world hospital, you know. And I look around and I say, you know, this just goes to show, live long enough, the people who hate you either die or retire. So I'm kosher now. So let me talk a little about the House of God. I hope these stories may be of interest to people. This book had the worst start in the world in every different way. I wrote it just as a kind of catharsis. I was interested in plays. So I asked a person in in the hospital I was working at, McLean Hospital, I said, do you know a novel, an agent for a novel? And she said, well, yeah, here's the name. She gave me a name. The woman wrote back and said, well, I don't do plays. I don't do plays, but you mentioned you had a doctor novel, a start of a doctor novel. And I had written that I was starting a doctor novel. Send me that. So I sent her that. And I forgot about it. I didn't want to write a novel, really. And a couple weeks later, I'm standing inside McLean Hospital, which is a big psychiatric institution outside of Boston. Phone rings. The receptionist says, oh, there's a person named, so I've forgotten her name. She wants to talk to you. So I get on the phone, and this is the first feedback from what I'd sent her. And what I'd sent her, I didn't even know you were supposed to double space things at the time. It had cigar stains, pipe ash, liquor, whatever. It was a mess. I'd sent it in, and I get on the phone. This is the first feedback. She says, well, I don't know if you're a madman or a genius, but I really like what you send me. And I actually had the presence of mind to say, well, I can't help you there, but you should know that I'm speaking to you from within a mental institution at this time. And that was the start of it. And, as I say, 7 drafts later, and I went to the publisher called me in before it was going to be published. And he said, well, we got the lawyer here. Lawyer? What's a lawyer here? We want to make sure that none of these characters are identifiable. I'm thinking to myself, oh, who isn't, Because it's my first novel. I didn't know you were supposed to disguise people very much. So I figure, okay, I'll give them one, And I said, well, actually, there is a person there that really is very identifiable. Who is he? Well, he's the chief of medicine. He's a kidney guy, right? He tucks his stethoscope into his crotch. He goes around whistling. And the lawyer looks at the publisher and he says, oh, this is bad. This is bad. This is very bad. So the publisher looks at me and he says, well, does he have a big red birthmark on his cheek? And I said, no. And he says, now he does. Open your book. First mention. All you need is one. That's an anti-libel case birthmark. All right. Let me I want to read 2 brief things from The House of God that were true. You can't believe how much of that novel was true. It really is kind of amazing. The first one is a guy called the Runt, and this is early in the year. We had a lunch, He was having a hard time. As he sat down to lunch, he took out a pill box, put a pill on it, and munched it down. When I asked what it was, he said, Valium, vitamin V. I've never been so nervous in my life. Does Valium help? I asked. Makes me kind of sleepy, but I feel pretty unflappable. I'm writing orders for it for all my patients. What? I said, you're putting all your patients on Valium too? He says, why not? They're all very nervous having me as their doctor. After the others had left, the Runt said he had a confession to make. It's about my 3rd admission last night. In the middle of all this trouble with the yellow man, this guy comes into emergency, and I couldn't handle it. I offered him $5 if he'd go home. He took it and left. That's a good technique, actually, when you're in the emergency room. So that's something that was true that I used. But I'm going to give you another example because it shows something about the beauty of writing and kind of why I write this. I'll read you the true part first. Yes. Okay. Well, actually, I'll tell you the true part. I had a patient who had a woman who had metastatic breast cancer, and she was in the hospital on the medical service just to manage, so the surgeons could open her up and see what was going on inside, if there's any hope for them to do anything. They operated. There was nothing they could do. They brought her back up to the medical ward, and she was in bed. She'd come out of surgery. She was awake and alert and all of that stuff, and nobody had told her what they found. Right? You talk about awful medicine. And the surgeon wasn't going to do it. He was done, And a private doctor sitting at home, he wasn't going to do it. I was her intern. I was supposed to do it. And As I wrote in the book, well, I didn't write this. Well, I said I can't do it, and he's over. The character Roy Bash, who stands for me, says that, and the fat man, who's the hero of the novel, who's this roly-poly guy from Brooklyn who knows everything. In the novel, this is. Let me go back a step. The wonderful thing about writing fiction. One of the wonderful things, I mean, you have to love it to do it because it's very hard, but one of the wonderful things of writing fiction, if you've done something you're ashamed of or guilty about or think, Jesus, I shouldn't have done that, you know, I call those things, hey, wait a second moments. We all have them in our daily life where we pass by somebody on the street and we don't do anything, we see someone hurt, we don't do anything, or we take some action we shouldn't have. You know, you say, hey, wait a second, why did I do that? You probably had a couple of these today already. And you know, you walk on. But when enough, hey, wait a second moments come up, then I have to start to write. And one of the things that you're able to do, like in this scene, is you're able to say, this is what I should have done. Or somebody should have done that I couldn't do, right? So, this is what I wrote. The resident called the fat man offers to do it. And then this is described, the character's describing it from the doorway. I watched him enter her room and sit on the bed. The woman was 40, thin and pale, she blended with the sheets. I pictured her spine, x-rays, riddled with cancer, a honeycomb of bone. If she moved too suddenly, she'd crack a vertebra, sever her spinal cord, paralyze herself. Her neck brace made her look more stoic than she was. In the midst of her waxy face, her eyes seemed immense. From the corridor, I watched her ask Fats her question, and then search him for his answer. When he spoke, her eyes pooled with tears. I saw the fat man's hand reach out and, motherly, envelop hers. I couldn't watch. Despairing, I went to bed. And then later the same night, I have the Roy character comes back, and he passes by the room. Roy glances into the room again. Fats was still there playing cards, chatting. As I passed, something surprising happened in the game. A shout bubbled up, and both the players burst out laughing. So that's what should have happened. And actually, for those of you who are early in your medical careers, those are instructions of how to deliver bad news to a patient, right? Go in the room, sit on the bed, let them ask their question. Don't run out of the room after you tell them the answer, you know. And people say there's not time to do this anymore, but it doesn't take that much time. Really, a good connection doesn't take that much time. Okay, so the thing I learned from the main thing I learned from the House of God was looking back. No, I didn't learn it then. You see, we were products of the 60s. And we learned that if you see an injustice and get together with other people with similar views, you can make things better, right? You can create some good in the world. And we did that. We helped put the civil rights laws on the books, and we stopped the Vietnam War. So that's the attitude we took into the internship. And we saw these things that weren't right. And you can read the novel as a sort of a manual of nonviolent resistance. You know, there are several ways in there. I don't have time to read them, but you can look at it that way. How do you resist the nonviolent? And this is more important than ever, as I learned last night from, you know, Emma McKenzie and Andrew about the state of medicine, medical training in Britain now. You know, where things are not right that are going on, and something's got to happen. And you know, doctors allying with patients, i.e., the general population, is the way that's going to change. When the patient population realizes that how doctors are being treated is hurting the care they can deliver, that's the way things are going to change. And we'll talk more about that in various different things on my trip here. I'm very delighted to do that. But what I learned basically, the reason that things were so bad in the House of God, I came to realize, was because it was a hierarchy, and in between power over system, and in between the interns, who were the lowest down, was the chief resident, and then there was the boss, the kidney guy, right? And the chief resident was siding with the boss because he wanted to get his horse farm out in the country, and get his fellowship and all that. And so we had nobody. Nobody stood up for us, right? There's a line in the book from the African-American intern, Chuck. He says, how can we care for patients if nobody cares for us? And so as the year goes on, and those of you who read it, the interns get more and more isolated, okay? One commits suicide, one goes crazy. Those are true. And here's the interesting part. Not only do they get isolated from each other, each of them gets isolated from their authentic experience of the system itself, right? You start to think, I'm wrong for thinking this is wrong. And that's really a bad state to be in. But so what happened in the house of God? There was a total focus on self. How can I survive? The community broke up. And there were very few ways that that connection was demonstrated. I'll just read a couple because it's interesting. Even back then, without realizing it so much, I created this character, the fat man, and he's someone who knows how to make good connection with everybody. And he knows how to resist the system too. So here are a couple things that show the way to go that I didn't realize until after I read the book. The fat man. I make them feel that they're still part of life, start of some grand nutty scheme instead of alone with their diseases. With me, they still feel part of the human race. And then Roy realizes at the end, the narrator, what these patients wanted was what anyone wanted, the hand in their hand, the sense that their doctor could care, i.e. a good connection. So there were hints in the house of God of the direction that I was going in all of this. And the main thing I say to medical school classes and everybody else is the most important thing in your training, which some of you in the back, the younger ones will, the only thing to remember is stay connected. Do not isolate yourself. That is a there are still, at NYU, there were 3 suicides last year, NYU Medical School at one point last year. It's a terribly difficult profession if you isolate yourself. And then I wrote a book called Mount Misery, which is about psychiatric training. I thought that psychiatrists would be more humane. They turned out to be less humane. I had to write that book. And then Janet and I, a next step I took was a very important step. Janet and I want to put this very simply. There's not really time to go into it too deeply. The dominant theme in Western psychology, theories of psychological health and growth, is a self theory, right? That you measure somebody's psychological health by this self, right? Freud was the epitome of that. He had no data except what he had from his patients, which isn't really data. And he said that the primary desire that we come into the world with are the libidinal drives of sex and aggression. That has been proven to be false. They've done split-screen studies, mother's face, about 3 or 4 month old baby's face, and they look at how much time it takes for each to react to a change of expression, either way, and it's in milliseconds. Smile, smile. The one thing that ruined the experiment and confirmed it was they said, okay, now moms, if your baby tries to react, if he's trying to make connection with you in any way possible, keep your face stiff. The babies went crazy. Mothers refused to go on. The primary desire we all come into the world with is a primary desire for connection, which is good news, because if you can get to that, people will embrace it, And anybody most of the people in the room, I think, know that by now. So, Janet started this and I joined her. The theory that was developed at Wellesley College, the Stone Center theory, is a relational theory, which says, and it's more in tune with what women are valued for, which is care, compassion, relationship. And the theory is relationally centered. The center is relationship, not self. That is, for each of us in this room, we want to go around and talk about it or write it down. The measure of your psychological health and growth is the quality of your relationships, is the quality of your connections. It shifts everything. Much more familiar to women than men. I've had to learn this through a lot of a lot of hard work, because the dominant culture in every way possible is an either-or culture. You know, the whole thing. America is the epitome of the self-centered or aggrandizing culture. It's, believe me, when you start to write about the importance and the centrality of connection, you see how you can be ignored by people who don't understand it at all. So, what does this mean practically, this theory of connection? Well, Jean Baker Miller, who was one of the founders of the Stone Center, put it very simply. She said, think of an interaction you've had with a person. It can be breakfast, it can be a meeting, it can be lunch, it can be anything. And if it's a successful encounter, if it's a good connection, 5 good things happen to both people, right? One is each person leaves with a sense of zest or more zest or energy. Think of when you drag yourself into a lunch and you have a great lunch with somebody. More zest or energy, right? More awareness of yourself and the other person. More valuing of yourself and the other person. More empowerment. That is, you're more ready to take action. I want to get back to that power. And then finally, a desire for more connection. Right? Doesn't that make sense? Sounds like it. If you think about what's the negative of each of those, that's depression. Right? Energy, valuation, knowledge, power. Now, in medicine, this is very important because a lot of men say, but if I go fully into this relationship, I'll lose myself. You women might have heard that, you know. And then you say, we started to say to them, but wait a second, haven't you found that when you're really in a good connection with her, you're more yourself? Feel better about yourself? Oh yeah, that's right. Why it's important for doctors is because in a good community of doctors, or in a good connection with anybody, a doctor, you are a better doctor. Because, first of all, you'll be more connected and empathic, but because you'll be more empowered to take right action, to use a Buddhist term, like, you know, right speech, right mindfulness. You're more empowered. Power in this model is not like, oh, I'm powerful. I walked in powerful, I'm powerful in the meeting, I'm going to be powerful when I leave, right? What this says is, suppose I walked into that lunch really feeling like I didn't have any way to take action in something at all. I wasn't empowered at all. You know, I'm done. If it's a good connection, what happens is that there's a rising of empowerment in the connecting, right? In connecting, both of you feel more ready to take action. And that's important. For medicine, there's one other thing I would say, and that is, well, for everything, connection comes first, rather than self or the patient. Connection comes first. What I mean by that is, if you're in a good connection, you can talk about anything, right? You'll get a history if that's what you're looking for with a patient. If you're not in a good connection, you're not going to be able to talk about anything, right? So connection comes first. And the other rule I sort of have for this, which is a general rule, is it's not only what you do or say, it's what you do or say next. Nobody gets relationship right. Doctors, patients, husbands, wives, nobody gets relationship right. It's what you do after you screw it up that distinguishes those marriages that fail, frankly, or those marriages that succeed. Nobody gets it right. I mean, whether you're talking about individual couples or doctor-patient, or Iraq and America, they never knew what they were going to do next in America. After they destroyed the country, nobody had a next plan. You know, it's so simple, but people don't think that way. They really don't. So, that is basically what I learned in all of that work with Janet on gender, because there are big gender differences. I'll tell you one impasse briefly that men and women typically get into. See if you can identify it. Maybe it's a cultural. Maybe you don't have these problems. You know, men and a woman are on a beach, have a very good time, picnic lunch, And she wants to get a little closer, make a little better connection. She says, "What are you feeling, darling?" And he looks around like he's been shot. The women will all start nodding now. And she says, "Tell me." And he starts to feel this icy feeling growing in his stomach and going up toward his heart like it's going to turn into ice. And he says, "I don't know." And she wanted to make even a better connection. "Well, sure you do. Come on, tell me." And then he's gone. He gets a glassy look in his eyes, right? And he's stiff and it's icy. And he says, still trying to stay in control, "Don't spoil it." And she says, "Oh, I'm spoiling it," right? And they're off, right? That's it. Big disconnect. Well, what's happening here? Well, we discovered something in this work. It's very important. Women have a real yearning to connect. Sometimes they describe it as a burning yearning. It's really important. In the face of women's yearning, what happens to a man in the yearning going toward is something we call male relational dread. And what happens is, if you ask men, what's going on in their heads is, nothing good can come of my going into this. It's just a matter of how bad it'll be before it's over. And it'll never be over. Right? And that's a relational impasse. Does that make sense to any of you? There are not too many beaches around here. But anyway. Okay, let me just go on a little bit to 2 examples of where this journey of mine into learning about the importance of connection has gotten to by this point. And I learned it all through my writing about it, The best example of the danger of isolation and the healing power of good connection is actually Alcoholics Anonymous and other 12-step programs. Because, do people know about AA at all? You've heard about it, yeah. Jan and I wrote a play about the relationship between the 2 men that led to the founding of AA and their wives, called Bill W. and Dr. Bob, which was off Broadway twice now. It ran for a year last year. And it's this marvelous story of how these 2 guys, one a doctor, Dr. Robert Smith was a surgeon in Akron, Ohio. How they were both terrible drunks. Bill was a stockbroker from New York. Bob was a surgeon from Akron. And they happened to be brought together by chance in Akron in 1935. And Bill came in and he said, I've been trying to deal with this, and I realized that the only thing that can keep a drunk sober is telling his story to another drunk. That is, it's an and program. You can't stay sober alone. And what Bob did, the doctor, Bill started talking, and he said, this was, a doctor told me it was disease, and this, and Bob says, a disease with signs and symptoms, a course and a progression, implying what? A treatment? So the guy that Bill met on his last legs was another guy on his last legs who was a drunk doctor, who said, he said essentially, if there's let's reframe it and find a treatment. And then that's what they did, and the treatment was to ask for help from someone else. It's mistakenly said to ask for help from God. Both these men didn't believe in a religious God when they met. They did, because they tried it. It didn't work. Prayer didn't work. None of it worked. What gets confusing is it's a spiritual, not a religious issue. The idea is that I myself can't keep myself away from a drink. I have to ask for help from something outside myself. Doesn't matter at all what it is. And these guys discovered that alcoholism is a disease with physical, psychological, and spiritual elements. Spiritual elements, in that sense, not religious, spiritual elements. And it had to be treated in all 3 arenas, which is the birth of the holistic movement in America in 1935. And that saved both of them. They never took another drink. And it's a remarkable story. If you go to the website, there's a samuelshem.com website, or go to Bill W. and Dr. Bob. There's a DVD of the play. It's very good, and there are scripts and stuff on there. And then the other, so that was really important to learn about to take the next step that says that there can be a relationship that's a spiritual relationship. You know, that the joining with another person lifts it not just into a good connection, but into something that's spiritual that can sustain someone through those kinds of things. And then the other thing that my most recent novel was called The Spirit of the Place, which through some stupidity of publishers is not available as a regular book in the UK, even though it won 2 National Best Book Awards in the United States. I don't know why they don't publish it here. It's sort of, this is what I was saying before, one of the wonderful things about being a writer is if you can't do it in life, you can write it, you can imagine it. So this book is a very simple book. It's imagined autobiography. It's a guy kind of like me going back to his hometown on the Hudson River in New York State called Hudson, New York. Let's go back. He's divorced. He's been running around the world at Doctors Sans Frontières. He winds up in Italy with this marvelous, marvelous woman. She's a yoga teacher. She's a Buddhist. She's sexy. She's smart. She's funny. As I said, you can do all this stuff in fiction. And he's finally found a love here. And then he hears that his mother's died in this town, and they couldn't find him, so he has to go back there to tie up things, and gets back there, and he never got along with his mother, hated the town for various reasons, and the terms of her will, which he needs money, is he has to live in her house in the center of town for a year and 13 days continuously, and then he gets the money and a big Chrysler. And he doesn't want any part of that. He's in love in Italy. Well, should we go do this? But one thing leads to another, blah, blah, blah. And he hooks up with his old mentor who got him into medicine, Dr. Bill Starbucks, who's one of these old-fashioned roly-poly. There's a line in the book, which was true. This is true of a guy that got me into medicine. Really wonderful, wonderful old guy. You know, he'd take barter from his patients. It was kind of rural out there, and they found out he loved scallions. So you walked into the office waiting in the springtime, it'd be all scallions. His breath was always scallions. He was great. He smoked. There's a yes smoking sign over his desk. And one of the lines is Bill. Bill always, when he was ushering you out of the office, his hand was on your shoulder. And it was cool in summer, warm in winter, that kind of guy. And what this character, so I could imagine all of this, that's based very closely on my mother and family life and all that stuff. But toward the end of the book, you see, so he's thrown into this, he winds up, the character named Orville Rose, he's the doctor for this town he hates, and he knows all these people from his childhood, and he's the doctor, and he's thrown into this mess with all these people, and by having to be a doctor in this town, he thought he was there to heal the town, and the town heals him. So. The last thing I'll talk about, the last thing that happens in that book, which is sort of where I am in my journey here about suffering and compassion. He is at a choice point, and he has to do one thing or another. And he hears, like in his head, not a crazy voice, he hears it like something comes to him, put it that way, something comes to him, like a voice, and it says, whatever you do, don't spread more suffering around. Don't spread more suffering around. And he makes his decision. And that's what this novel is about. As I said, he's forced to deal with all of this stuff, this real suffering, and he is healed by this. And so the issue about all of this, about learning what I'm trying to talk about tonight, everybody suffers, You have little suffering, you have big suffering. Everybody suffers. That's the Buddha's first noble truth, as many of you know. It's not the suffering, it's how you walk through it that matters. If, as a man, you're often American male, I've said, stand tall, hold your ground, draw a line in the sand. If you are trained to walk through suffering alone, you're guaranteed you're going to suffer more and you're going to spread more suffering around. If, on the other hand, you walk through suffering, through the crucible of suffering, I would call it, with others, especially with caring others. And that's where how many of us are doctors or healthcare people, that's where we come in. That's our job. We went into medicine for that, basically, most of us. If we can walk through suffering with caring others, we will not suffer as much, and we will not spread so much suffering around, and we might even increase in understanding and be redeemed. Thank you.